We're going to start our unit on the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is often overlooked by anatomy students. You don't hear a lot about it. When you think anatomy, you probably think nervous system, muscular system, digestive system. Endocrine system, though, is a very important part of our anatomy and our physiology. So let's find out why. Okay, so first off, let's talk about what is the endocrine system. Well, what it is essentially is it's a network of cells and tissues that, organs and tissues that are really responsible for regulating our homeostasis of the human body. And it works hand in hand with the nervous system. So the nervous system is made up of these things called neurons, right? And neurons send information from one place in the body to another through these long axons, and it's electrical, it's fast, your nervous system works very quickly, and it's going to either synapse with another neuron, like in the brain and the spinal cord, or it's going to synapse with a muscle, which we talked about earlier. And then the third possibility is going to be a gland, and that's going to be our endocrine system. So the endocrine system works right along with the nervous system, and it's another communication device. So basically, when you think about the human body and you think about homeostasis, you're thinking about body temperature, you're thinking about blood sugar, you're thinking about pH, you're thinking about, heart rate, all these things that control your body and make it run. There's a thin window in which our body needs to maintain this thing called homeostasis, and that is accomplished with the endocrine system. Now, there's a big difference with how those two work, though. So a lot of times, like I said, the endocrine system often gets overlooked. When you think about communication in the body, you probably think nervous system, right? And the nervous system, that's what it does. It's for communication. It sends information far distances very quickly. And the big difference between the endocrine system and the nervous system is that the nervous system is working both electrically and chemically. So there's an electrical action potential which travels down the axon in milliseconds, and then when it gets to the end, to that axon terminals, it's going to send out its chemical neurotransmitters to initiate another action. Where with the endocrine system, what works there is it works a little differently. We have these things called hormones, and hormones are chemicals that get secreted by these glands, and they go out to the body and they diffuse through the body, and they're going to move to a different area in the body to elicit some response, but it's going to be a little different than the nervous system. So think of the nervous system as like calling up somebody directly, and you immediately contact them. You're sending information to one individual. That's like the nervous system. It sends very quickly, it sends information to one target. The endocrine system is more like opening your window and yelling out to your neighborhood. It's going out to everybody, and whoever's listening is going to hear it, but it's a much slower process, right? So it's going to leave, let's say, for example, I'm talking about my pancreas, right? So the pancreas is a gland, and it releases insulin, and that insulin is going to be excreted into the body, and it's going to make its way all over the body, but it's only going to impact the part that is listening. And what do I mean by listening? I mean has receptors. So for example, the liver is going to listen to insulin. It's going to have a receptor for insulin, and insulin is going to trigger the liver to start taking in more glucose and storing it as glycogen. So when you think about communication in the body, it's nervous system and the endocrine system. They both do their jobs a little bit differently, but they're both really doing the same thing. They're sending out a chemical that is going to trigger a response. Okay, let's keep going here. So when you think about the endocrine system, you're thinking about, hopefully, you're thinking of hormones now, right? You're secreting hormones. But there's a couple different versions of secretion. So let's talk about that for a second. We're talking about the endocrine system. And endocrine, essentially, this means something is being secreted into the internal environment of the body. And it's essentially going to stay inside the body, and it's going to act on something that's a distance away. It's not going to be right there, but it's going to stay within the confines of the human body. It's going to stay in the blood vessels. It's going to stay in the organs. An exocrine secretion, on the other hand, is going to leave the body. It's going to be secreted externally. So, for example, your salivary glands are going to secrete saliva, or I should say excrete, right? So excrete saliva into the mouth. Your sweat glands are going to excrete sweat onto the skin. It's going to leave the body. And that's the big difference there. And just two more quick terms that you might not be familiar with. The first one is paracrine. And para just basically means it's next to it. So a paracrine gland is going to be just releasing some chemical that stays where it is. It's not going out into the bloodstream to go somewhere else. It's staying in those tissues, and it's going to impact just the cells around it. So, it's just going to be just really what's right there. And then finally, we have autocrine. And autocrine is going to be a gland or a cell that secretes just and it impacts itself. So it's not going somewhere else. It's just staying right where it is, and it's going to change the cell that actually excreted it or secreted it. Let's keep going. Okay, well, actually, this is going to be an image that of a sweat gland. So just to kind of reiterate, this is an exocrine gland because it's leaving the body. So you can see this is the sweat gland here, which is made up of our epithelial cells. Now, this is a merocrine gland, and I know that because the cell is not being broken down at all. It's just the contents of the cytoplasm are being released, and they're going to go out onto the skin. So that's why that's considered an exocrine gland. Let's talk about the job of the endocrine system. So what makes the endocrine system work as well as it does is it's specific. It's very specific with what it acts upon. If the endocrine system was just sending out chemicals to the body and it affected whatever it wanted to, that would be a problem because you wouldn't be able to control your body. Things would just be firing off all the time and you wouldn't have any control over it. So what makes the endocrine system work so well is that these hormones are specific to receptors. Think of it like a lock and a key. And that is a common trend when you're looking at life, right? Life is made, living things are machines. I spend a lot of time talking about that in class. And what are we machines made out of? Well, we're not made out of metal. Well, we actually kind of are made out of metal, but we're made out of these metabolic machines, these little molecules that have shapes. And they have shapes and they fit certain ways. And you have, your receptors that have a certain shape. So these hormones are going to fit into the correct receptor and do the job that they're supposed to do. So it's a unique binding site, and these are site specific. So it's a very precise system. And what do they do? What does the endocrine system do? It does a lot. It does a lot, right? We have many different glands. We have many different tissues that are going to secrete hormones, and they do many different jobs. The main one that you should think of is metabolic, right? We're going to keep metabolic is kind of a general term, but the metabolic processes of the body, digestion, building molecules, things like that. It's going to control how fast reactions occur, speed them up or slow them down, depending on the situation. Transporting things across membranes, that's an important one. That's going to be your steroids. And then also, growth and regulation of development. One of the reasons I'm a high school teacher is that middle school seems like a disaster to teach. I mean, that at that age, the amount of changes your body is undergoing, you're literally going from being a child to an adult physically, and that requires a lot of hormones. And those hormones have a lot of impacts. So, I don't know that I could handle that. But hormones do a lot. When you think of the endocrine system, you probably think of the word gland. And you should think of the word gland because if it has gland after it, it's going to be some either endocrine or exocrine gland, right? So this is just a list of the glands that when you think of the endocrine system, these are the main glands involved. Now, this list is not inclusive of every gland in the body. These are the major glands. We are finding out more and more by the year that there are a lot more different hormones that we didn't know about. Okay, so let me go through this list real quick, and then we'll talk a little more about that. So when you think of glands, you think pituitary gland, right? The pituitary gland is the master gland, and I'm going to talk more about that a little later in this unit. We have our thyroid gland, our parathyroid gland, which even though they are connected to each other, they do different things. So they're right next to each other. The parathyroid is actually on the thyroid gland, but they have different jobs. The thymus, the adrenal gland, the pancreas, the pineal gland, some of these we've talked about throughout the year. The gonads, so in males, testes, and females, it's ovaries. And then the placenta is actually a gland in itself. It only exists when a woman is pregnant, but the placenta actually produces hormones as well. But as I was saying earlier on the slide, it's not just these list of glands which produce hormones. Great example is they found out more recently that fat cells, your adipose cells, actually produce a hormone called leptin. And leptin is what is going to control appetite. So we're finding out more and more, every year that there's all these different types of hormones that have reactions, and we're finding out more and more what these hormones do. Okay, I'm going to keep moving through the section. This is just another slide about the organs. So just in case you were wondering where these organs are, if you aren't familiar already, your pituitary gland and pineal gland are in the brain. The hypothalamus is actually attached to the pituitary. We're going to talk more about that. Your parathyroid gland, your thyroid gland are going to be right here, basically just where your larynx is, your voice box. You have your thymus, which is right in the middle of your chest. We talked a little bit about that with the immune system. And then we have our adrenal glands and our pancreas are right next to each other. The adrenal glands are like little hats on top of the kidneys. And then finally, we have our ovaries and testes in the female and in the male. So those are just the locations of those organs. I'm going to finish up by talking a little bit more about hormones and just a little bit about how they work. So hormones are chemicals, right? These are chemical messengers, and chemicals are made up of molecules, right? Molecules are made up of atoms, and these atoms are going to fit together in certain ways to make certain shapes, and then those shapes are going to have some kind of a job. So let's go through the different types of hormones. The most common type of hormone in the human body are going to be your steroid hormones, and these are going to be fats. So these are lipids, and they are produced. A lot of these are produced by the liver, and these are going to be basically they're made from cholesterol. So the liver makes the cholesterol, and then that cholesterol gets converted into these lipid fatty shapes, and they're going to be ring shaped. So you can see, you probably learned about that in chemistry class. These chains of carbons can form rings. They can be long chains, straight chains. Examples of that would be like estrogen and testosterone are both going to be steroid hormones. The next type are called amine hormones, and amines are basically they're made mainly from the amino acid tyrosine, right? So we have tyrosine here, and if you take a look, you can see tyrosine can get manipulated to become these different amines. So, for example, epinephrine is going to be a good example, and norepinephrine, which we're going to talk a little bit. But those are produced by your adrenal gland, and that is what causes the fight or flight response. So that's going to be an example of an amine. Melatonin, tryptophan, those are examples of amines because they're derived from tyrosine. Okay. Protein hormones are going to be just long chains of amino acids, and that's done through protein synthesis, and these are going to be hormones that are produced by your thyroid and parathyroid. So again, we'll talk more about these specific glands farther on in this lecture or in this unit. And the last couple are going to be your glycoproteins, which are essentially proteins that are held together by sugars. That helps them to be transported through the blood. And then peptides are going to be your short chains of amino acids. So again, peptides and protein hormones are very similar. They're both made of amino acids. The difference is the size. So if it's small enough, it's considered a peptide, and if it's long enough, it's considered a protein. At least that's my understanding of it. And then finally, we have our prostaglandins, and these are paracrine, so they don't go anywhere. They stay where they are, and they're made of fats as well, and they're not as common, but they exist. Okay, how do hormones work? Well, I'm going to finish up. Actually, you know what? I'm going to hold off on this, and I'm going to go over this in another lecture. This feels like enough for one lecture. Thank you very much.